He built a tech empire worth millions, but it took one glance at a little girl in a white dress to shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. Los Angeles, 2017. The city buzzed with heat and ambition, a constant thrum of movement and noise that mirrored the pace of Matthew Carter's life. At 33, he had everything most people dreamed of: wealth, status, influence. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, he lived in a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, traveled in private jets, and made headlines simply by walking into a room. On the surface, Matthew's life sparkled. But beneath the polish, something crucial had eroded. He came home late again that night, past midnight. His tie hung loose, his voice hoarse from back-to-back meetings and investor calls. The apartment was silent, dimly lit, unusually tidy. No toys scattered across the floor. No soft laughter or baby giggles from the nursery. A sinking feeling gnawed at his chest as he walked through the quiet halls. When he stepped into the bedroom, the drawers were open. The closet, half empty. Her side of the bed untouched. On the nightstand, he saw a handwritten note, folded in half. He knew what it was before he even picked it up. "I can't do this anymore," it began. Haley's handwriting was still as neat and deliberate as he remembered from college. She had taken Sophie, their 1-year-old daughter, and left. There was no drama, no scene. Just the clean finality of absence. She hadn't taken much, just what mattered. Diapers, clothes, formula, a few toys. The rest remained, like a museum of a life that used to be whole. He stood there for a long time, holding the note in one hand, his phone in the other. He didn't call. Not yet. A part of him had known this was coming. In the beginning, Haley had tried, God, she had tried. She waited up late for him, brought Sophie to his office during lunch breaks, asked for just one weekend without his laptop. And he'd promised. Promised after the next pitch. After the next product launch. After the next round of funding. But the next never came. And now, neither had they. Outside the window, the city stretched endlessly, millions of lights, millions of stories. His success had made him a giant among men, but in this moment, he felt impossibly small. He had climbed to the top of a tower, only to realize it was built on sand. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at a pair of tiny pink socks still on the floor. Sophie's. Her little feet had kicked them off one night as Haley rocked her to sleep beside him. He hadn't noticed then. He noticed now. San Francisco, 2024. The restaurant was one of those modern rooftop places with glass walls, ambient jazz playing low, and the kind of service that made you feel important just for sitting down. Matthew Carter wasn't meeting anyone special that night, not romantically, at least. It was a business dinner, another in a long string of negotiations with a startup he was planning to acquire. He had arrived early, as always, preferring to scan the room, control the environment, and settle into his thoughts before the performance began. He sat by the window, watching the city shimmer beneath a pale evening sky. The waiter brought him a bourbon, neat. He thanked him and glanced briefly at the menu, though he rarely changed what he ordered. As he looked up again, something shifted in his periphery. A child. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, skipping lightly between the tables, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. She wore a white dress, the kind with delicate lace and small satin bows. She wasn't loud or disruptive, just curious, moving through the space as if she owned it. Matthew's glass paused halfway to his lips. His heart, out of nowhere, stuttered once, hard. The girl turned toward him. Her eyes, crystal blue, locked with his for the briefest moment. He froze. Not just because she was beautiful in that effortless, childlike way, but because she looked like him. No, more than that. She looked like Sophie. His body remained perfectly still, but inside, something erupted. He hadn't seen his daughter since she was 1 year old. He had no updated pictures, no social media clues, no school photos tucked into wallets or pinned to a fridge. Nothing. But there, in front of him, stood a child who had his eyes, his cheekbones, even a certain defiance in her posture that felt bone deep. It didn't make sense, but it also made perfect sense. The moment stretched, became too much. The girl turned away, running back toward the far side of the restaurant where a woman sat near the window, sipping from a wine glass, her back partially turned to him. Matthew stood without thinking, like his legs had decided before his brain caught up. As he walked toward the table, time folded in on itself. The years fell away, the noise of the restaurant faded, and then, she turned. Haley. She looked different, older in the way that only emotional weight can shape a person. Her hair was shorter now, more practical, curled at the edges. Her features were the same, sharp, elegant, unmistakably her, but her eyes were colder, cautious. She saw him, and her face didn't crumple, didn't soften. It stiffened. But she didn't look away. Matthew, she said. Just his name. No surprise in her voice, but no warmth either. It was a recognition. A collision. He glanced quickly to the girl who now stood beside her mother's chair, gripping the edge of the table, still watching him with that same curious intensity. He couldn't breathe. That's her, he whispered, not knowing if he was asking or stating. Haley didn't move. Yes, she said quietly. That's Sophie. He didn't sit right away. He just stood there for a moment, staring at Haley, then at the little girl next to her, the weight of 6 lost years pressing down like a slow avalanche. Sophie tilted her head slightly, trying to place him, the way children do when they sense familiarity without memory. Haley finally nodded toward the empty chair across from her. Matthew lowered himself into it slowly, feeling like the air around them had grown heavier, denser, as if every word that might be spoken would require effort just to push through it. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't ask how he had been. She just watched him with a quiet tension in her shoulders, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Sophie leaned into her side, whispering something too soft for him to hear. Haley bent her head and answered gently, brushing the girl's curls from her forehead. The gesture was so natural, so maternal, that it cut Matthew in a place he didn't even realize still bled. I didn't expect this, he said at last, not really sure what he meant by it. He hadn't expected to see them again, certainly not like this. He hadn't expected his heart to remember so quickly how it used to feel to be part of something more than just work and routine. Neither did I, Haley replied. Her voice was low, level. We don't usually come here. It was a friend's idea. Birthday dinner. She's beautiful, he said, looking at Sophie again. Her eyes flicked up to meet his and didn't shy away this time. She was studying him carefully, like she was cataloging the shape of his face, the sound of his voice. She is, Haley agreed. And smart. And stubborn. Her gaze flicked back to him. Like someone I used to know. He nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't know how to find you. You didn't really try, she said, and though her voice was calm, the wound beneath the words was clear. You had your world. You let us go. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that he had hired a private investigator, that he had searched court records, old addresses, anything he could find after the initial months of silence. But by then, Haley had already moved on, left no trail. And he had let the weight of his guilt and his shame anchor him to inaction. Instead of chasing them, he buried himself deeper into his work, into board meetings and quarterly reports, into partnerships and stock prices, telling himself that maybe she had been right to leave. You're right, he said. I didn't try hard enough. That admission seemed to surprise her. Her posture softened a little, just a fraction. Sophie, still listening, began to draw invisible patterns on the table with her finger. Does she know who I am? He asked. Haley shook her head. I didn't think it was fair to tell her a story with no ending. I want to know her, he said, the words falling out like they'd been waiting for years to be spoken. I don't know how, or what that would even look like, but I want to try. She's not a project, Matthew, Haley said. You don't get to just insert yourself now that it's convenient. I know, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. I saw her, and I knew. It was like being struck by lightning. I couldn't walk away. Silence lingered between them. Outside the windows, the lights of the city glimmered, but inside the table held its own gravity, its own universe of unspoken things. Finally, Haley looked at Sophie, then back at him. You can have dinner with us. Tonight, she said carefully. We can talk. You can talk to her. Nothing more for now. He nodded, and something in his chest eased, just slightly. That's all I'm asking. They sat in awkward quiet for a while. Sophie picked up her napkin and folded it into a triangle, then tried to balance it on her water glass. Matthew watched her, fascinated by the smallest movements, the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she concentrated, the tilt of her eyebrows, the rhythm of her speech when she finally asked him if he liked cats. And he answered. They talked about animals, then books, and slowly, the ice began to crack, 1 inch at a time. Haley mostly listened. She watched the exchange like someone standing on a frozen lake, unsure if the surface would hold or give way. But Matthew didn't push. He asked simple questions. He laughed softly at Sophie's stories. He forgot, for a moment, that he was supposed to be cautious. He just let himself feel. As the waiter cleared their plates and brought dessert, Sophie looked up at him again, her eyes still impossibly blue. You talk like me, she said. And your eyes are like mine. He smiled, caught somewhere between joy and heartbreak. I think we have a lot in common. Haley's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Her guard didn't drop completely, but for the first time since he sat down, she looked at him not as a stranger, not as someone from a life she left behind, but as someone who might still matter. Over the next few weeks, Matthew saw Sophie several times. At first, it was always in public places, neutral ground, as Haley called it. A museum here, a bookstore cafe there, an afternoon in the park. Haley was always nearby, watching quietly, sometimes sitting on a bench with a coffee, pretending to read, but her attention was clearly locked on them. It wasn't easy for her to let go, even just for a few feet. And Matthew understood. He hadn't earned trust yet, he was barely beginning to scratch at the surface of what it might mean to be a father to a child he hadn't held in 6 years. Sophie, for her part, was cautiously open. She was curious but not naive. She didn't call him Dad. She called him Matthew. He never corrected her. Instead, he followed her lead, letting her guide how close he could get. Sometimes she'd reach for his hand when they crossed a street, and those fleeting seconds would live in his mind long after the day ended. Other times she'd pull back into herself, growing quiet, retreating into a book or turning her face toward the window in the car when he tried to make conversation. He tried not to take it personally, but of course he did. Every silence from her felt like a judgment on the years he hadn't been there. One rainy afternoon, they sat in a library, tucked into the children's reading corner. Sophie had chosen a stack of picture books she claimed were too easy but still fun, and she made him read them out loud. She corrected his voices, told him which characters were supposed to sound funny and which ones were serious. He listened carefully, adjusted, and saw a spark of approval in her expression. At one point, she giggled so hard at a frog wearing a tutu that she had to lean into his shoulder to keep from falling off the bench. He didn't move. He barely breathed. It was the first time she had touched him without thinking. Later that day, while Haley stood a few feet away talking to a friend they'd run into on the sidewalk, Sophie and Matthew sat on the edge of a fountain. She swung her feet over the side, watching the water ripple. "Why weren't you there?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but direct. "When I was little. When I had my cough all the time." Mommy said I used to cough a lot. The question pierced through him with such sharpness that he forgot how to answer. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at her, so calm, so direct, and realized he had no excuse that would make sense to a child. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you buried yourself in work because it was easier than facing your failures? That you let time pass because you thought it was already too late? I made mistakes, he said finally. Big ones. I thought I was doing the right thing by working a lot, by trying to build something important. But I forgot the most important thing in the world. I forgot you. She didn't say anything at first. She looked down at the water, kicking her shoes softly against the stone. Mommy doesn't forget things like that, she said after a while. No, he replied. She doesn't. She's a better person than I was. Sophie glanced at him, then looked away again. You're trying now. I am, he said, feeling the words catch in his throat. And I'm going to keep trying. No matter what. That seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. She nodded slightly, then slid off the edge of the fountain and started walking toward Haley without another word. He watched her go, his heart aching with the weight of what had been lost, and with the fragile hope of what might still be saved. Later that night, Haley sent him a photo. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a small stuffed frog they had picked out together at the bookstore earlier that day. The message was short, she smiled in her sleep. He stared at the picture for a long time. He didn't reply. There was nothing he could type that would say more than what he felt in that moment. She had smiled. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn it. One cold morning in early February, the sky over San Francisco hung low and gray, and the city moved a little slower than usual under a blanket of fog. Matthew had just stepped out of a board meeting when he saw the missed call from Haley. She never called him during work hours, not unless it had something to do with Sophie. His chest tightened slightly as he returned the call, already bracing for bad news. But when she answered, her voice wasn't panicked, it was resolved, calm in that way that signaled she had already made a decision before picking up the phone. I got a job offer, she said without any build-up. In Austin. It's a creative director position. Good company, great benefits, better schedule. I'd be stupid not to take it. He stood on the rooftop terrace of his building, the wind tugging at his coat. It took a second for the words to sink in, and then another second for the implications to follow. When would you leave? He asked, though he already knew the answer would come too soon. End of the month, she replied. They want me there by March. I'd need time to settle in, get Sophie enrolled in school. Everything would move fast. He closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. And you're planning to take her with you? She's my daughter, Matthew, Haley said softly, but not apologetically. Of course I'm taking her. She's mine, too, he said. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet desperation beginning to seep through the cracks. You can't just take her halfway across the country. Not now. You had 6 years, Haley said. 6 years to call, to write, to find us. You came back into her life 2 months ago. Don't pretend that gives you rights, it doesn't. He didn't respond right away. He stared out over the city, barely seeing it. Traffic moved like silent film reels far below him, lives intersecting, separating. Somewhere down there, Sophie was in school, laughing or reading or maybe painting, unaware that the people who loved her most were on the edge of tearing her life in two. I can't lose her again, he finally said, and his voice cracked just enough for her to hear something real behind it. Haley sighed. Then what do you want me to do? Say no to a job that could finally give us stability? That could give Sophie more time with me, better opportunities, better schools. I want to be part of her life. Not on holidays, not in weekend visits, but every day. I know I didn't earn that before, but I'm trying to now. Don't punish her for my failures. She was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, he heard the weight of her own exhaustion. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want another battle. She had fought too many already. And yet, they were here again. I don't want this to turn into a custody war, she said, almost more to herself than to him. Then let's not make it one, he said. Let's do this right. But what was right? For her. For Sophie. For him. The lines blurred. A week later, he filed for joint custody. The legal process was swift and sharp, like the slice of a cold blade. Lawyers laid out their histories like chess pieces, his absence, his wealth, her stability, his effort, her sacrifices. Everything was weighed, measured, documented. They met in mediation more than once, and each time ended in cold standoffs. Matthew remained calm on the outside, but inside, every moment felt like a countdown toward losing his daughter all over again. Haley, though clearly overwhelmed, stood her ground. She didn't scream. She didn't throw accusations. She simply presented the truth. She had raised Sophie alone. She had been both mother and father. She had held her through sickness and school projects and nightmares. And now, just as things were finally balancing, Matthew wanted to rewrite the rules. But something shifted during one of their last sessions. The judge, tired of the formal back and forth, requested to speak with Sophie privately. Both parents were nervous, but they agreed. Sophie sat in a quiet room with child specialists and the judge. When asked about her feelings, her answers were simple, but clear. I love my mommy, she said. She takes care of me. She knows my bedtime songs. And what about your father? The judge asked. Sophie hesitated. He's learning, she said. But he tries. I think he wants to know me better. The judge asked where she would like to live. I want to be with mommy, she said. But I want to see Matthew too. I want both. It was that last sentence that changed everything. Later that night, when the court ruled in favor of a shared custody agreement, Sophie staying with Haley during the school year but spending every holiday, every summer, and long weekends with Matthew, he didn't feel like he had won. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. And that, for the first time in his life, was enough. The morning of the hearing arrived with an eerie stillness. The streets of San Francisco were unusually quiet, wrapped in a blanket of morning fog that clung to the sidewalks and muted the city's usual noise. Matthew woke before dawn, long before his alarm, and sat on the edge of his bed in the dim light. He had slept no more than an hour, maybe two. His mind had been restless, circling around a single thought: what if today ended with Sophie walking out of his life again? He dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing a navy suit, not too sharp, not too casual, and a plain tie. He didn't want to look like a CEO today. He wanted to look like a father. A man who had made mistakes but was trying to make them right. As he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The clean-cut lines of his face were familiar, but there was something different in his eyes now, something heavier and more grounded. At the courthouse, the waiting room was colder than it needed to be, and the fluorescent lighting made everything feel clinical and detached. Haley sat at one end of the row of plastic chairs, her lawyer beside her, flipping through paperwork. She wore a simple gray dress and had pulled her hair back into a low bun. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. When Matthew walked in, she looked up, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. He gave her a small nod. She didn't return it, but she didn't look away either. Their lawyers spoke in hushed tones, negotiating last-minute details and clarifying procedural steps. Matthew wasn't listening. His eyes kept drifting to the door Sophie would come through. They had agreed she would speak to the judge alone, accompanied only by a court-appointed child specialist. It was standard in cases like this. Still, the idea of her sitting alone in a room answering questions about who she loved more tore at him in ways he couldn't articulate. When she finally entered, he stood instinctively. She was wearing a navy blue dress with little stars embroidered on the collar, and she held her small hands tightly in front of her. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked both older and more fragile than he remembered. She glanced at him quickly, then at Haley, then down at her shoes. The court officer led her through a side door, and then she was gone. The next hour passed like a slow bleed. No one spoke much. Pages rustled. Pens clicked. Every second stretched. Then, at last, the judge reappeared and asked both parties to return to the courtroom. The judge, a calm woman in her 60s with a face lined by years of decisions both painful and necessary, began speaking without preamble. She reviewed the facts, summarized the arguments, and acknowledged the emotional weight of the case. Her voice was measured, almost detached, but then she paused and looked up directly at Matthew and Haley. "This is not a case about unfit parents," she said. "This is a case about timing, about presence, and about the difficult task of balancing history with hope." Then she read from her notes. When asked who she wants to live with, Sophie said, "I want to be with Mommy. But I want to see Matthew too. I want both." The words landed like a quiet storm. Matthew looked down. His jaw clenched involuntarily, not in frustration but in something more fragile, relief and grief folded together. The ruling came next: primary residence with Haley in Austin, with scheduled and protected visitation for Matthew, including major holidays, school breaks, and alternating summers. Weekly virtual calls. Monthly in-person visits when possible. A parenting coordinator would help mediate the transition. Haley was still, unreadable. Matthew didn't move either, afraid that any motion might fracture the delicate calm in the room. The judge closed the session with a final reminder: this child is not a prize to be won. She is a person. And she will need both of you, in different ways, to walk through this with her. Outside the courtroom, the air was crisper, the sun beginning to push through the clouds. As they walked out, Matthew caught up to Haley. "She said she wanted both of us," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Haley looked over, her voice soft. "She did." They stood there for a moment, no longer opponents, just two people trying to navigate the aftermath of a life once shared, now split and stitched back together in a different shape. "Thank you," he said finally. "For not pushing her." Haley nodded. "Just, don't disappoint her again." "I won't," he promised, and this time, it wasn't a performance or a plan. It was a vow. One made not to a court, not to Haley, but to a little girl with star patterns on her dress, who had stood in front of a judge and asked for something neither parent had dared to hope for. A family, not perfect, but possible. The first real day of the new arrangement felt strange, almost surreal. Matthew stood outside the modest one-story house he had just moved into in the quiet suburbs outside Austin, Texas. The yard was smaller than anything he'd owned before, the front steps chipped, the mailbox slightly crooked. But he had chosen it on purpose. It was only 5 minutes from Sophie's new school, and 2 blocks from the local library. There was a park down the road, and a small lake nearby with paddleboats and fishing docks. It was a place built for real life, not press releases and polished meetings. For the first time in years, he didn't care that there was no elevator or doorman, no sweeping skyline view. All he cared about was what would happen inside those walls. He spent the first few days setting up the place with a kind of obsessive care. He bought furniture that didn't match anything from his penthouse back in San Francisco: soft beige couches, a wooden dining table with a couple of paint stains already on it, bookshelves he built himself, crookedly but proudly. He turned one of the bedrooms into a space for Sophie, decorating it with the help of a handwritten list she had mailed him: glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling, beanbag chairs, a frog-themed bedsheet set, and shelves for all her important stuff. He hung her drawings on the wall even before she officially moved anything in. The first time Sophie walked through the door, her backpack bouncing, she paused in the hallway and took it all in like she was stepping into a different world. She didn't run up to him or cry or say anything dramatic. She just looked around, wide-eyed, and finally said, "You really did all this?" "I did," he said, smiling nervously. "For you." She nodded and wandered toward her room without needing an invitation. Later that evening, while they were eating pasta and garlic bread he had almost burned, she said it again, more softly, like it had finally settled in. "You really did all this." Their days slowly began to take shape, like clay being molded in uncertain hands. Matthew drove her to school every other week, picking her up with snacks in the passenger seat. They tried to build routines, even if they were awkward at first. Tuesday was movie night. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, even when they turned out lumpy. He helped her with homework, read with her in the evenings, and tried not to cry when she asked for just one more chapter, like it was something she had done with him 1,000 times before, even though this was still new. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes she withdrew for no reason he could understand. Sometimes she got quiet during dinner and wouldn't talk much until bedtime. And sometimes she would mention a memory, like the time she and Haley built a cardboard castle in their old apartment, and he'd be reminded again of how many moments he had missed, how many years he couldn't get back. One Saturday, they sat on the edge of the dock by the lake, their feet dangling over the water. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to slip behind the trees, and Sophie was humming some tune from a cartoon she liked. "You ever think about when you were little?" he asked. She shrugged. "Sometimes. Mommy tells me stories about when I was a baby." He looked out at the lake. "I wish I could have seen more of those years. I think about them a lot." Sophie didn't say anything for a moment. Then she leaned a little against his arm, not enough to call it a hug, but more than a casual movement. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters, right?" He looked down at her and smiled. It wasn't a grand moment, not a scene for a movie. But it was real. It was slow and quiet and true. Later that week, Haley stopped by to drop off a school form that needed both their signatures. She stepped inside just long enough to see the living room, the way Sophie's shoes were by the door, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, a glass of orange juice still on the kitchen counter. "You've made it feel like home," she said, almost surprised. "I'm trying," he said. She nodded, lingering at the doorway before leaving. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she gave him a small, tired smile and turned to go. As the weeks passed, Matthew's life began to quiet in a way it never had before. He stepped away from daily operations at his company, handing over the reins to someone he trusted. His days were no longer broken into meetings and stock updates, but into school pickups, math quizzes, and lunchbox notes. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and completely transformative. Every evening when Sophie curled up in her bed and asked, "Are you staying tomorrow too?" and he could say, yes, with absolute certainty, he felt something inside him stitch back together. He wasn't rebuilding the past anymore. He was building something new. Something solid. Something that could last. The morning of the school play was bright and unusually warm for early spring. The trees lining the street in front of the elementary school were just beginning to bloom, casting soft shadows on the sidewalk as parents and children hurried toward the entrance with bouquets, cameras, and folded programs clutched in their hands. Matthew stood near the back of the auditorium, a small bouquet of yellow daisies in one hand and his heart thudding in his chest like he hadn't felt since his first public speaking event years ago. But this was different. This wasn't about shareholders or headlines. This was about Sophie. He spotted her behind the curtain a few minutes before the show began. She was in costume, a white robe with silvery wings and a simple halo made of wire and tinsel. Her blonde curls framed her face, and her blue eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on him. She didn't wave, but she smiled, and that one look held more power than anything he'd ever experienced in a boardroom. He smiled back and mouthed, "You've got this." She nodded slightly, then turned back to her classmates. Haley arrived shortly after, slipping into the seat beside him. They exchanged a brief look, an acknowledgement of how far they had come without needing to say a word. There was no tension anymore, no lingering heat from the courtroom or old arguments. There was still history between them, but it had softened, like old photographs that no longer hurt to look at. When the play began, the audience hushed as the children filed onto the stage. The performance was simple, charming, filled with forgotten lines, exaggerated gestures, and a soundtrack that occasionally skipped. Sophie played the angel who guided two lost children back to their family, a role she took on with an earnestness that made Matthew's throat tighten with emotion. Her voice was clear and steady, her stage presence surprisingly natural. Every time she turned to face the audience, her eyes searched for her parents, always finding them in the crowd. As the final scene approached, the children stood in a semicircle, and the lights dimmed except for the soft glow around Sophie. She stepped forward alone, holding a small lantern prop, and spoke the last lines of the play, lines she had helped write with her teacher's encouragement. "This is a story about finding the way home," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "Sometimes people get lost, even grown-ups. But love is what brings them back. This is for my dad. He found me. And I found him." The room fell into stunned silence, and then came the sound of 100 parents clapping, cheering, some wiping tears. But Matthew couldn't move. He sat frozen, his eyes full, his heart cracked wide open. Haley reached over and put her hand gently over his. He didn't even look at her. He just squeezed it. After the show, children flooded the hallways, pulling off wings and tossing halos, trading flowers and cupcakes. Sophie ran up to him, breathless and glowing with pride. He crouched down and handed her the daisies, and she threw her arms around his neck without hesitation. "You were amazing," he whispered. "I mean it. You were born for this." She grinned. "I told you I liked the spotlight." Haley joined them a moment later, smiling quietly. She knelt beside them, brushing Sophie's hair back from her face. "You made a lot of people cry in there, you know that?" Sophie looked proud. "Good tears." The three of them stood there in the hallway for a long moment, surrounded by the noise and chaos of other families, and yet wrapped in a quiet of their own. It wasn't perfect. It was still new and fragile. But it was real. As they walked out into the sunshine, Sophie reached up and grabbed both their hands without saying anything. One small hand in each of theirs, swinging slightly as they moved down the steps and into the street. They weren't a traditional family. They weren't what they used to be. But they were something new, something chosen, something earned. Matthew looked at Haley as they walked, his voice low so Sophie wouldn't hear. "Do you think," he asked, "maybe one day, we could find our way back too?" Haley didn't answer right away. She just glanced over at him with a look that held 1,000 stories, some painful, some beautiful, all unfinished. "Maybe," she said softly. "One day." And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. This ending isn't loud or cinematic, it's something more powerful, honest. It closes not with grand gestures or perfect resolutions, but with the quiet, lived-in truth that real healing takes time, presence, and patience. Matthew doesn't magically erase the past, and Haley doesn't instantly fall back into his arms. But they both choose to show up. They choose their daughter. And in doing so, they begin to choose each other again, not for who they were, but for who they're becoming. That's what makes this story resonate. It reminds us that redemption is rarely dramatic, it's in the slow rebuilding, the daily showing up, the unspoken forgiveness, and the soft hope that maybe, one day, broken things can become beautiful again. Laura had spent 6 years keeping her secret buried, convinced the past would never catch up to her. But all it took was one moment for everything to unravel. She hadn't meant for her daughter to see him. She hadn't expected Emma to run straight to the most powerful man in the room, grab his hand, and say the one word that changed everything. "Daddy." Julian Carter's sharp green eyes snapped to the child at his feet. Then, slowly, they lifted, to her. Laura's heart pounded. She had spent years making sure this would never happen. But now, there was no way out. Laura King had never wanted to bring her daughter to work, but today, she had no other choice. The babysitter had cancelled at the last minute, and Laura couldn't afford to miss her shift. Working as a maid at one of the most luxurious hotels in New York meant she had to follow strict rules, and one of the most important ones was never bringing personal matters into the job. But what choice did she have? She had no family nearby, no friends who could watch Emma on such short notice. So, she made the only decision she could. She took her daughter with her, praying that she would stay quiet and out of the way. As they entered the grand lobby of the hotel, Laura squeezed Emma's small hand, lowering her voice. "Remember what I told you, sweetheart. Stay close to me and don't talk to anyone, okay?" Emma nodded, her green eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the massive crystal chandeliers, the polished marble floors, and the elegantly dressed guests who moved gracefully through the space. She had never been anywhere like this before. To her, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Laura, however, had no time to admire the luxury around her. She kept her head down, walking quickly, trying to make sure no one noticed that she had broken the rules by bringing her daughter. But then, just as they reached the housekeeping service door, Emma suddenly stopped. Her small hand slipped from Laura's grasp, and before Laura could react, the little girl took a step back, her eyes locked on something, or someone, across the room. And then, without warning, she ran. Laura's heart nearly stopped. "Emma," she called, her voice sharp with panic. She rushed after her daughter, but Emma was fast, weaving through the crowded lobby with surprising agility for a 6-year-old. It all happened too quickly. By the time Laura reached her, Emma had already stopped in front of a tall man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. The moment she saw who it was, her breath caught in her throat. Julian Carter. He stood at the reception desk, his presence commanding, his sharp green eyes focused on something in front of him, until Emma threw her small arms around his leg and clung to him as if she had known him forever. Laura's stomach twisted painfully. Then, in a voice filled with pure, unshakable certainty, Emma said the one word that made the entire lobby fall silent. "Daddy." Julian froze. Slowly, he looked down, his expression shifting from mild irritation to complete and utter confusion. His eyes met Emma's, then lifted, searching the crowd, until they landed on Laura. For a long moment, no one moved. Laura felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath her feet. She wanted to grab Emma and run, to undo this moment, to pretend it had never happened. But it was too late. Julian Carter, the one man she had spent years trying to avoid, was now staring at her with a mixture of shock, recognition, and something else. Something dangerous. She knew, in that instant, that nothing would ever be the same again. Laura's entire body tensed as Julian's sharp green eyes locked onto hers. The hotel lobby, once filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, seemed to fall into complete silence. She could see the confusion in his expression, the way his brows furrowed slightly, as if he was trying to piece together something that made no sense. But what terrified her the most was the realization forming in his gaze. He wasn't just looking at her. He was looking at Emma. Emma still clung to his leg, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his expensive suit as if she had finally found something, or someone, she had been searching for. She looked up at him with bright, innocent eyes, waiting, expecting something Laura wasn't sure Julian knew how to give. Julian slowly pried Emma's hands away, his movements careful, almost hesitant, as if touching her too roughly would shatter the delicate moment. He knelt to her level, his tall frame folding gracefully, and studied her face as if seeing something for the first time. His jaw tightened slightly, and Laura knew exactly what he was seeing. The same dark brown hair. The same striking green eyes. The same sharp features that mirrored his own. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, but no less commanding. "Who told you to say that?" Emma tilted her head, confused. Nobody. His expression didn't change. Then why did you call me that? Emma frowned, as if the answer was obvious. Because you're my daddy. Julian inhaled sharply, as if the words had physically hit him. Laura couldn't let this go on any longer. She rushed forward, gently pulling Emma away from him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Emma, sweetheart, come here. Emma didn't fight her, but she looked up at Laura with uncertainty, her small brows drawing together. Did I do something wrong? Laura forced a smile, even as panic clawed at her chest. No, baby, but we need to go. Before she could turn away, Julian straightened to his full height, blocking her path. His presence was overwhelming, as it had always been, and Laura hated how easily he could still make her feel small. His voice was sharper now, controlled but edged with something dangerous. Laura. What the hell is going on? She swallowed, gripping Emma's hand tighter. It's nothing. She's just confused. Julian let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly. Confused? He glanced down at Emma again, then back at Laura, his expression darkening. She doesn't look confused. She looks certain. Laura's stomach twisted. She needed to get out of here. She needed to get Emma away before this turned into something she couldn't control. But before she could take another step, Julian's voice dropped lower, his words slicing through the air like a blade. Is she mine? Laura's breath caught. The question hung between them, thick and suffocating, and for a brief moment, she considered lying, denying everything, pretending this wasn't happening. But Julian Carter wasn't a man who accepted half-truths. He would tear apart every lie until he found what he wanted. She met his gaze, her fingers tightening around Emma's hand. Julian, let us go. His jaw clenched. Answer me. Laura felt Emma's tiny fingers squeeze hers, a silent plea for reassurance. She had never wanted this moment to happen. She had never wanted Julian to know. But now, there was no escape. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to speak the words that would change everything. Yes. The single word cut through the space between them like a gunshot. Julian didn't move. He didn't blink. The only sign that he had heard her was the way his chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths, as if he was trying to contain something explosive inside him. His eyes flickered to Emma again, and this time, Laura saw something shift in his expression. The shock was still there, but now, it was mixed with something else. Something unreadable. Something terrifying. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. We're not done here. And Laura knew, with absolute certainty, that he meant it. Laura's grip on Emma's hand tightened as she felt the weight of Julian's words settle over her. The way he said it, calm, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something unshakable, sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't making a request. He wasn't asking for a conversation. He was making a statement, a declaration of intent, and she knew exactly what it meant. Julian Carter wasn't the kind of man who let things go. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Emma was still watching them both, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. Laura had to get her out of here before this turned into something even worse. Julian, she said carefully, keeping her voice even, this isn't the time or place for this. His jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. Then tell me when and where. Her pulse quickened. She needed to think. She had spent the past 6 years avoiding this exact moment, convincing herself that keeping the truth from him was the best option. He had never wanted a family. He had been too consumed with his business, with power, with control. The Julian she had known all those years ago had made it clear that nothing, not love, not commitment, not even the possibility of something real, was more important than his empire. And yet, standing here now, with Emma clutching her fingers and Julian staring at her like she had just shattered the foundation of his entire world, she realized she had underestimated him. Emma shifted slightly, looking up at Julian with open curiosity. "Do you know my mommy?" Laura's breath hitched. Julian's expression softened just slightly as he glanced down at the little girl. "Yes," he said, his voice quieter now. "A long time ago." Emma frowned, tilting her head. "Then why didn't you come find us?" Laura felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to redirect the conversation, but Julian beat her to it. His gaze snapped back to Laura, and in that instant, she knew she had lost control. "That's a good question," he said, his tone sharp, edged with something dangerous. "Maybe your mom can answer that." Emma looked up at her expectantly, completely unaware of the storm brewing between the adults in the room. Laura took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "Emma, sweetheart, why don't we go home? It's been a long day." Emma hesitated for a moment, but she nodded. Before Laura could move, Julian stepped forward, blocking her path once again. "You're not going to walk away from this," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Not this time." Her stomach twisted. She should have known it wouldn't be that easy. Julian had always been relentless when he wanted something. He wasn't going to let her disappear without answers. She met his gaze, lifting her chin slightly, refusing to back down. "I don't owe you anything." Something flickered in his expression, anger, disbelief, something deeper she couldn't quite name. "You owe me the truth." Laura clenched her jaw. She didn't want to have this conversation here, in the middle of the hotel lobby, with Emma standing between them, watching. She needed time. She needed space. But Julian wasn't going to give her either. She exhaled slowly. "Fine. Tomorrow. Meet me at the cafe on 5th and Madison at 10. Julian studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to believe her. Then he gave a short nod. "I'll be there." Laura didn't wait for anything else. She turned, guiding Emma toward the exit, feeling Julian's gaze burning into her back the entire way out. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the crisp evening air. She had kept this secret for 6 years. Now, in less than 5 minutes, everything had changed. Tomorrow, she would have to face the consequences. Laura barely slept that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of Emma breathing beside her. The weight of what had happened earlier in the hotel pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She had spent 6 years avoiding Julian Carter, convincing herself that she had made the right decision, that keeping Emma a secret had been the only way to protect her daughter from the kind of man he was. But now, everything had unraveled in a matter of minutes. And tomorrow, she would have to face him. Her mind raced with everything that could go wrong. Julian wasn't the type to accept things at face value. He would demand answers, explanations. And Laura wasn't sure she had the strength to give them. She turned onto her side, watching the peaceful rise and fall of Emma's small chest. She had done everything to give her daughter a good life. But had she stolen something from her too? Had she made a decision that wasn't hers to make? By the time the sun rose, her nerves were already frayed. Emma woke up full of energy, completely unaware of the storm brewing in Laura's mind. She hummed as she ate breakfast, chattering about the books she wanted to read that day, the games she wanted to play. Laura forced herself to smile, trying to keep her own tension from showing. As 10 o'clock approached, she found herself standing outside the cafe on 5th and Madison, her hands gripping the strap of her purse too tightly. She had chosen this place on purpose. It was public, neutral territory, a place where neither of them could lose control. But even as she stood there, waiting, her heart pounded so loudly she thought she might be sick. Julian arrived exactly on time. He walked toward her with the same confidence he had always carried, his presence commanding without effort. His dark brown hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit pressed as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom. But his eyes, those sharp green eyes that had once captivated her, were filled with something colder now. Without a word, he opened the door and gestured for her to go inside. She hesitated only a second before stepping in. The cafe was quiet, the morning rush already over. She chose a small table in the back, away from prying eyes, and sat down, her hands clasped together on the table. Julian took the seat across from her, resting his forearms on the surface, his gaze never leaving hers. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The tension between them was thick, unspoken words filling the space like a heavy fog. Finally, Julian broke the silence. "Start talking." Laura inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. "Where do you want me to start?" His jaw tightened. "You know exactly where." She glanced away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than she wanted it to be. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after we broke up." Julian didn't react immediately. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Laura clenched her fingers together, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I didn't think you'd want to know." His eyes flashed with something close to fury. "You decided that for me?" She swallowed hard. "Julian, you made it very clear back then what your priorities were. Your business. Your empire. You told me there was no room in your life for anything else. You told me you couldn't afford distractions." His expression darkened. "And you assumed that meant I wouldn't want my own child?" Laura's throat tightened. "I assumed that meant you would never be the kind of father Emma deserved." Silence stretched between them. She could see the muscle in Julian's jaw working, the way his fingers curled slightly against the table. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. "Do you have any idea what you took from me?" Laura felt something twist deep inside her. She had told herself for years that she had done the right thing, that she had protected Emma from a man who would never put her first. But hearing him say it like that, hearing the quiet pain beneath his anger, made her question everything. "I did what I thought was best," she whispered. Julian exhaled slowly, as if trying to contain whatever storm was raging inside him. "And now what?" He leaned forward slightly. "Now that I know, what happens next?" Laura hesitated. That was the question she had been dreading. She had never planned for this moment, never considered what would happen if Julian ever found out. The thought of him suddenly wanting to be part of Emma's life terrified her. She had spent so long believing he wasn't capable of love, that he wouldn't care. But now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know," she admitted. Julian's eyes didn't waver. "Well, I do." Her stomach tightened. "Julian. I'm not walking away from this." His voice was firm, unwavering. "She's my daughter. And I intend to know her." Panic surged through Laura. "You can't just decide that." "The hell I can't." His voice sharpened. "You kept her from me. You made a decision that wasn't yours to make. Now it's my turn to make one." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She had spent 6 years believing she was in control of this secret. But now, as she looked into Julian Carter's unrelenting green eyes, she realized she had just lost it. Laura felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. She had known this moment was inevitable the second Emma had called Julian "Daddy," but hearing him say it so clearly, so definitively, made the reality of the situation sink in. Julian wasn't going to walk away. He wasn't going to let this go. The control she had held over the situation for 6 years had just been ripped from her hands, and she had no idea what to do next. She forced herself to keep her voice calm. Julian, this isn't as simple as you're making it seem. His expression hardened. It's not simple at all, Laura. But it's also not something you get to decide on your own anymore. She pressed her lips together, fighting back the frustration bubbling in her chest. I didn't keep her from you to hurt you. I did it to protect her. Julian's eyes darkened. From what? From me? She hesitated for half a second too long. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, but laced with something sharper. You really think I wouldn't have been a good father? Laura exhaled slowly. I think you weren't ready to be one. Julian leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping against the table as he studied her. And you decided that before even giving me the chance? She hated the way he said it. Like she had stolen something from him. Like she had taken a choice that wasn't hers to take. She looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. You had just started building your company, Julian. You were working 20-hour days, flying across the country, sealing deal after deal. You barely had time to sleep, let alone time for a family. You told me yourself that relationships were a distraction. That emotions made people weak. So yes, I made a choice. I chose to give Emma a life where she would never feel like she was second place to anything. Julian's fingers curled into a fist on the table, and for the first time since she had seen him that night in the hotel lobby, she saw something more than anger. She saw regret. His voice was quieter now. And what if I would have changed? Laura felt her throat tighten. Would you have? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat there, his green eyes searching hers, and she could see it happening, the realization settling in. The understanding of just how much time had been lost. Finally, he let out a slow breath. It doesn't matter anymore, does it? Laura swallowed hard. No. It doesn't. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, heavy with years of words left unsaid. Julian finally broke the silence. I want to see her. Laura's heart pounded. Julian. I want to know my daughter, he said firmly. I don't care what happened in the past. I don't care what mistakes were made. I don't care if you think I wasn't ready then. I am now. And you're not going to keep me from her. Laura felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. She had spent 6 years keeping Emma safe, keeping their life simple, keeping everything in her control. Letting Julian in meant risking all of that. It meant letting Emma love someone who could hurt her. It meant letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Julian Carter was capable of being more than the man she had once known. And that terrified her more than anything. She let out a slow, shaky breath. Okay. Julian's eyes locked onto hers. Okay. She forced herself to nod. You can see her. But this has to be on my terms. Slowly. Carefully. I won't let you walk into her life just to walk out again. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I'm not going anywhere, Laura. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But she also knew Julian Carter had never stayed in one place for long. Laura spent the rest of the day trying to prepare herself for what came next, but no amount of thinking could settle the storm raging inside her. Julian was going to meet Emma. It was no longer a distant possibility or a vague fear she could push away. It was happening. She had spent 6 years protecting her daughter from this exact moment, believing she was doing the right thing, but now she wasn't sure anymore. Emma was too young to understand the weight of what was coming. To her, the world was simple. She had a mother who loved her, a home that was safe, and dreams that hadn't yet been touched by disappointment. But Julian had the power to change all of that. Laura sat at the kitchen table, watching Emma as she colored in a picture book, humming softly to herself. The innocence in her expression made Laura's chest tighten. How was she supposed to explain this to her? How was she supposed to prepare her daughter for a father who had never been there, a father she had only just discovered existed? Taking a steadying breath, she spoke gently. "Sweetheart, can we talk for a minute?" Emma looked up with a bright smile. "Okay." She set down her crayon and leaned forward, her little hands resting on the table. Laura hesitated for just a second. "Do you remember the man we saw at the hotel yesterday?" Emma's eyes lit up. "My daddy?" Laura forced a small smile, ignoring the way those words sent a pang through her heart. "Yes, him." She swallowed. "I talked to him today, and he wants to meet you." Emma's face filled with something Laura couldn't quite place: excitement, curiosity, maybe a little uncertainty. "Really?" Laura nodded, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the table. "Yes. But I want you to know that you don't have to do anything you don't want to. If you feel nervous or unsure, you can tell me, and we'll figure it out together." "Okay." Emma tilted her head, thinking. "Is he nice?" Laura's chest ached at the question. She didn't know how to answer. She had known Julian when he was younger, when his heart had been guarded by ambition, when love had been something he had considered a weakness. She had no idea what kind of man he was now. "He wants to get to know you," she said carefully. "And I think he's trying to be nice." Emma considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. I want to meet him." Laura had known this was coming, but hearing her daughter say it so openly, so simply, made the reality of it even heavier. She reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair behind Emma's ear. "Then we'll meet him tomorrow, at the park. Just for a little while." Emma smiled, her excitement impossible to contain. "Can I show him my drawings?" Laura's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I think he'd like that." That night, Laura barely slept. Every worst-case scenario ran through her mind, every fear she had tried to bury resurfacing with full force. What if Julian didn't know how to be gentle with Emma? What if he got bored and left? What if Emma got attached, only to be hurt in the end? The next morning, she found herself standing in the middle of a quiet park, Emma's small hand tucked in hers, waiting for Julian to arrive. The sky was bright, the air crisp, children playing on the swings and couples walking along the paved paths. But none of it eased the tension sitting heavy in Laura's chest. Then she saw him. Julian approached with the same confidence he always had, his tall frame cutting effortlessly through the space between them. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a dark sweater and jeans, but somehow, he still looked completely out of place, as if the world of playgrounds and children's laughter wasn't something he had ever stepped into before. When he reached them, he stopped a few feet away, his gaze flickering between Laura and Emma. His expression was unreadable, guarded, but there was something in his eyes that made Laura's breath catch. Emma looked up at him with wide green eyes, her tiny fingers tightening around Laura's hand. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Julian crouched down to her level, his movements slower than usual, more careful. "Hi, Emma." His voice was softer than Laura had ever heard it. Emma studied him for a second before smiling. "Hi." Julian hesitated, as if he wasn't sure what to say next. Then he cleared his throat. "Your mom said you like to draw." Emma's face lit up. "I do. Want to see?" She reached into the little bag slung over her shoulder and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to one of her favorite drawings. Julian took the notebook carefully, his eyes scanning the colorful lines and shapes. "You're really good at this." Emma beamed. "Mommy says I have an artist's heart." Julian glanced up at Laura for just a second before looking back at Emma. "I think she's right." Laura felt something in her chest tighten. This was unfamiliar territory for Julian. She could see the hesitation in his movements, the careful way he chose his words, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong. But he was trying. And she hadn't expected that. Emma bounced on her heels. Do you like to draw? Julian let out a small breath, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Not really. But I like to look at good drawings. Emma grinned. I can teach you. Laura's stomach twisted at the ease of it all, at how quickly Emma accepted Julian into her world, how naturally she assumed he would stay. She wanted to believe this would work. That Julian wouldn't hurt her. That this wouldn't end in the heartbreak she had always feared. Julian looked up at Laura again, and for the first time, there was something unspoken between them. A silent acknowledgement of what was at stake, of what this meant. Laura took a breath, forcing herself to speak the words that scared her the most. Do you want to sit with us for a while? Julian nodded. Yeah. I'd like that. As they moved toward a nearby bench, Laura watched as Emma chattered happily, already flipping through her notebook to show him more. And for the first time in years, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end the way she had always feared. Laura had expected the first meeting between Julian and Emma to be tense, awkward, and filled with uncertainty. But what she hadn't expected was how quickly Emma had accepted him, how effortlessly she had pulled him into her world. After their first meeting in the park, Julian started coming around more often. At first, it was slow, short visits, small conversations, cautious interactions. But Emma didn't seem to feel the same hesitations Laura did. She had already decided that Julian was her father, and to her, that meant he belonged. She never questioned why he hadn't been there before. She never held any resentment. She just welcomed him with open arms. Laura, however, wasn't so sure she could do the same. One evening, a few weeks after that first meeting, Julian knocked on her apartment door. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, still trying to adjust to the sight of him standing there, so different from the world she had built for herself and Emma. He wasn't dressed in one of his expensive suits, but he still looked out of place in her small, modest home. Is Emma ready? He asked, glancing past her into the apartment. Laura stepped aside, letting him in. She's finishing her drawing. She won't leave until she's happy with it. Julian smirked slightly, setting a small bag down on the counter. She takes her art seriously. Laura crossed her arms, studying him. She does. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. These moments had become more frequent, times when they were alone, forced to acknowledge the complicated reality of what they were doing. Laura wasn't sure what their relationship was now. They weren't enemies, but they weren't exactly friends either. They were something in between, something undefined, something held together by the small girl in the other room who had no idea how complicated the past was between them. Julian ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I was thinking, he said, his voice quieter now. Emma's getting comfortable with me. I want to spend more time with her. Laura tensed. She sees you almost every day. That's not what I mean, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. I want to take her out. Just me and her. Laura's stomach twisted. She had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. For 6 years, Emma had never been out of her sight for more than a few hours. The thought of her being alone with Julian, of trusting him enough to take her somewhere, to be responsible for her, sent a wave of anxiety through her. Julian must have seen the hesitation in her face, because his expression softened slightly. Laura, I know this isn't easy for you. But I'm not going anywhere. And I need to start building something real with her. Laura swallowed, her fingers tightening against her arms. What if she gets too attached? Julian's jaw tightened. She's my daughter. She should be attached. Laura looked away, trying to find the right words, trying to make him understand. I need to know you're not going to disappear. She trusts so easily, Julian. If you walk away, I won't. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. She turned back to him, searching his face, trying to see if there was any trace of the man she had once known, the man who had been so consumed with ambition that nothing else had mattered. But the man standing in front of her wasn't that same person. He was still guarded, still sharp, but there was something different now. Something steady. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "Where do you want to take her?" Julian's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like relief. "There's a children's museum downtown. I thought she'd like it." Laura hesitated for just a second longer before nodding. "Fine. But if she asks for me, you bring her home immediately." Julian nodded. "Of course." Before Laura could say anything else, Emma came bounding into the room, holding up a fresh drawing. "Look, Daddy. I made this for you." Julian crouched down, taking the paper from her hands. It was a picture of the three of them, Emma in the middle, Julian on one side, Laura on the other. His breath caught slightly as he looked at it, his fingers brushing over the small, colorful lines. "This is amazing, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than usual. Emma grinned. "You have to put it somewhere special." Julian smiled, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. Carefully, he folded the drawing and tucked it inside, right next to his business cards and important documents. Laura watched the way Emma's face lit up, the way Julian held on to the drawing like it meant something, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about him. The morning of Emma's first outing with Julian arrived faster than Laura was ready for. She had barely slept the night before, her mind plagued with worry. It wasn't that she believed Julian would intentionally hurt Emma, she knew he wouldn't, but trust didn't come easily to her. She had spent 6 years protecting her daughter, making every decision with careful thought, ensuring that Emma never felt abandoned or unwanted. Letting her go, even for a few hours, felt like handing over control of something she had held on to too tightly for too long. Emma, however, was nothing but excited. She bounced around the apartment as Laura helped her get dressed, chattering about all the things she wanted to see at the museum. Laura forced herself to smile, not wanting her own fears to ruin the moment. This wasn't about her. It was about Emma. A knock at the door made Laura's stomach tighten. She took a slow breath before opening it, and there he was, Julian, dressed casually in a dark sweater and jeans, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. But his eyes were sharp, scanning her face as if he could see the battle going on inside her. "Morning," he said. Laura stepped aside, letting him in. "You're on time." Julian smirked. "Of course. I'm trying to make a good impression." Before Laura could respond, Emma ran up to him, practically vibrating with excitement. "Daddy! Are we going now?" Julian crouched down to her level, smiling. "Yeah, are you ready?" Emma nodded so fast that her curls bounced. "Mommy packed me a snack, and I brought my notebook in case I see something cool to draw." Julian glanced at Laura, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he turned back to Emma. "That's a great idea. You'll have to show me everything you draw when we're done." Emma beamed, grabbing his hand as if she had known him her entire life. Laura forced herself to take a step back. "Call me if she wants to come home." Julian's expression turned serious. "I will." She hesitated, looking between him and Emma, every protective instinct screaming at her to find a reason to keep her daughter here. But she couldn't do that. Emma deserved this chance. She knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Have fun, sweetheart." Emma nodded. "I will. Love you, Mommy." Laura kissed her forehead. "Love you too." She watched as Julian led Emma out of the apartment, the door closing behind them, leaving her standing in the silence of an empty home. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Hours passed more slowly than she thought possible. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt into her throat, but each time, it was nothing urgent. A text from Julian saying they had arrived. A picture of Emma grinning in front of a dinosaur exhibit. A message telling her they were getting lunch. When the knock finally came in the afternoon, Laura rushed to open the door. Emma stood there, grinning from ear to ear, her hands clutching a small bag from the museum gift shop. "Mommy! It was amazing," she said, pushing past her and running inside. "There were fossils, and space stuff, and Daddy bought me a book about planets because I told him I wanted to be an astronaut." Laura's heart ached at the way Emma said it so easily, like Julian had always been there, like she had never spent years without him. Julian stepped inside after her, watching Laura carefully. "She did great." Laura met his gaze, searching for any sign that this had been a mistake. But all she saw was something steady. Something real. "Thank you," she said softly. Julian nodded. "I meant what I said, Laura. I'm not going anywhere." She exhaled slowly, looking at Emma, who was already flipping through her new book, completely at ease. Maybe, just maybe, she could start believing him. This story isn't just about a secret coming to light, it's about the power of second chances and the weight of the choices we make. Laura believed she was doing the right thing by keeping Emma away from Julian, convinced that she was protecting her daughter from disappointment. But in the end, she wasn't just shielding Emma, she was shielding herself. She had spent years fearing the man Julian used to be, never once considering that people can change, that time can shape someone into something more than what they were. Julian's journey is just as profound. He starts as a man consumed by ambition, someone who once saw relationships as distractions, only to realize that the most important thing he had ever missed out on was right in front of him. His fight to be in Emma's life isn't just about responsibility, it's about love, about proving that he can be more than the man Laura once knew. The final moments of the story don't promise perfection, but they promise hope. Laura doesn't fully trust Julian yet, but she's willing to try. Julian isn't a perfect father, but he's staying. And Emma, the heart of it all, finally has the family she never knew she was missing. It's a reminder that love isn't always about getting things right from the start. Sometimes, it's about choosing to stay, choosing to fight, and choosing to believe that it's never too late to be better.